Ladies and gentlemen, let us start the first panel of this forum, which is devoted to the Polish-British relationship after COVID and after Brexit. But before we start, since it's the very first panel, I have to do some housekeeping. So each panel will be devoted into three parts. The first one is statements from our excellent speakers. Then we will have discussion within the panel. And then we'll accept questions from audience who is live here in this room, as well as all the participants who are active online. Let me introduce our panelists. We have an excellent set of panelists today. Let me introduce Mrs. Eva Grosman, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Centre for Democracy and Peace Building in Belfast. Let me introduce Mr. Władysław Teofil Bartoszewski, who is an MP for the Polish People's Party, the Polish Coalition, and who is a member of the Polish-British Parliamentary Group in the Polish Sejm. Let me introduce Dr. Rupa, who is a Labour MP and a member of the all-party parliamentary group on Poland in the House of Commons. And let me introduce Mr. Charles Grant, who is Director and founder of the Centre of European Reform in London. So, as I said, I would like to invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to give your assessment in short speech of 5 minutes of the future of Polish-British relations from your each individual unique perspective, taken your unique background as parliamentarians, as experts, as academics, and your assessment of impact of COVID on those relations. Mrs. Grosman.
Thank you. Whenever I arrived in Northern Ireland, I've been told never to talk about politics or religion, and here I am at the British-Polish Forum talking about Northern Ireland and Brexit and the protocol and the Polish community there. When I first arrived, just 3 years after the Good Friday Agreement, there was just a handful of Poles. After Poland joined the EU, suddenly the number went up to 50,000. It was a massive shock for the local community, especially for the unionist community who, after a little while, find out that Poles are actually Catholics. It changed the dynamic enormously. I was initially engaged in a private sector, but slowly started moving into work with the local communities, with the police service of Northern Ireland, because what started was the number of hate crime attacks. It was very, very difficult for people in Northern Ireland to accept difference. We set up Unite Against Hate campaign, then slowly I moved to work in the Northern Ireland Assembly, running a program, capacity building program for elected members. And what I noticed that my Polishness helped me because I was a bit of an insider-outsider. It helped me to cross different, especially throughout the sectarian divide. Right now, the number of Polish people in Northern Ireland probably went down to about 25,000. We know that with the EU settlement scheme, there is over 1 million people from Poland on the British Isles, with Northern Ireland, Scotland, in Wales, Poles being the biggest group and second biggest in England, just after the Romanian community. A few years ago, I've been asked to go to Kabul, out of all the places, to share Northern Irish experience. So it was really funny whenever I was briefed by the Foreign Office to deliver a statement with my Polish accent on the British policy there. As a result of this trip, we set up a Centre for Democracy and Peace Building together with Lord Alderdice and Sir Geoffrey Donaldson and other representatives from different sides of the community. Because we noticed that there is something really, really unique about Northern Irish peace process and experience of Northern Ireland, something what we can share internationally. which takes me to the issue of the protocol, the issue of the Polish community in Northern Ireland. First of all, with regards to COVID, about 20% of Poles in Northern Ireland left the region as a result of COVID. Polish community in Northern Ireland is slightly different to the Polish community in Britain. It's relatively new. A lot of people are employed in the agri-food sector and hospitality, quite often through recruitment agencies. Therefore, whenever come back to Brexit, whenever the COVID started, there was very little support for people who did either work on 0 hours contracts. Therefore, there was some movement of people, perhaps slightly different to the rest of Britain. On the positive note, as a result of the staff shortages right now, the working conditions of Poles in Northern Ireland is improving. Moving from 0 hours contracts to permanent contracts, from agency work to working directly with the employers. However, there is also another big issue, which is illegal migrants, and something what can also result, if unchecked, in human trafficking. The cap of £26,000 for Northern Ireland, it's really, really high. This is something what cannot be met with agri-food sector and with hospitality industry. So whenever we started with a little bit of hostility and hate crime, things definitely stabilized in recent years, thanks to the massive effort of both the Polish diplomats, but also people across the political spectrum. And as we are moving forward, I think that a lot of employers are now starting missing Poles, and everything is forgotten. Please come back. We talk not only about Brexit, but also about consequences of COVID and disturbance to the supply chains. And this is not only something what needs to be addressed in Northern Ireland, plus the added issue of the protocol, but also across Europe and the whole world.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bartoszewski, please.
I have lived in the United Kingdom in the 80s and 90s, and was a friend of quite a large number of Eurosceptics, some of whom played a serious role in the UK politics, and some of whom still do. So I was not surprised about Brexit per se, because the debates about it continues for 30 years. And I understood their position. But it's one thing to understand it and one thing to be on the receiving end of it, living in Poland. Brexit is bad for Poland. There's no question about this. I know that the UK, being the 5th largest or maybe 6th largest now with India, economy in the world, will manage. It's quite obvious. I remember the non-Eurosceptic Lord King who said in 5 years it would make no difference whatsoever if we're in or out. Britain will manage because it's a great power, a great economic power as well. From the point of view of Poland, I regret it for 2 reasons. One is we may have an agreement between the UK and the EU, but if you look at the economic links, if you look at the trade of biggest UK partners in Europe fell by over 30%. Germany, the Netherlands, France a little bit less, and it's very difficult to recover. What it means for the Brits, it's good enough to go to Waitrose or Sainsbury's in London and see empty shelves because the goods are not delivered. Britain is missing 100,000 lorry drivers, who, by the way, they were largely Polish. And they don't want to go to Britain because of the hassle involved in crossing the non-EU border anymore. I regret it for more fundamental reasons. The UK was the best partner for Poland in the EU because we shared a certain political philosophy. We shared the John Stuart Mill liberalism and the dislike of enforced bureaucratization and enforced federalization of Europe. And we had a partner who was able, due to his size and importance in the EU, to sway the other European states to follow a more liberal, not statist course. Now that is gone. We don't have it anymore. And that is a serious loss. Secondly, the UK armed forces were the most important armed forces in Europe. Still are. But it's not the same not having them in. I'm strongly against cutting the number of armed forces in the UK. I think it's a big mistake. I speak now as a British citizen, so I'm entitled to my opinion. I don't vote in Britain anymore, but had I voted, I would have been very much against this. Because it's not possible to play a global role, which the UK is now saying is going to do, while at the same time reducing the number of armed forces and putting them somewhere else. And they are extremely good. On the other hand, I'm extremely pleased that since 2017, we've got the Defense and Security Cooperation Treaty, bilateral treaty. So it's in addition to NATO, in addition to all possible things which a compass within EU may achieve, because I think the future for our cooperation between the UK and Poland is very much in the sphere of security, including cybersecurity, including intelligence and other matters like that, which that treaty allows us to do. And I think that there is a way out, because we actually share quite a lot of British attitudes, and I think we should do it not only within NATO, well, of course we will, but also bilaterally, because I do not expect much to happen in the military and intelligence and security sphere in the EU as it is now.
Thank you very much. Rupa, please.
Thank you. And I must say I'm very honoured and privileged to be here. In the home of the Prudential, my late father was the man from the Prue. He worked for many years in High Holborn. He took the tube every day. So what am I doing here? Well, look, I am a member of Parliament 3 terms now, which normally would mean 15 years. But because we have had an election every other year, 3 times, this only means 6 years in my case. But it does mean that I have lived through Brexit and I have lived through the pandemic. Now people mentioned Afghanistan is a big thing in all our inboxes. And I represent the most Polish constituency outside Poland. So that is Ealing Central and Acton. And people talk about the 04 expansions and how that brought the Poles in. In Ealing and Acton, they were always there. From my recollection, we had a Polish church since the 70s, I recall. And I think that parish was established in 1948, I've been told. So when I was growing up, I had friends called Dorota and Maci, and I thought it was quite normal to go to Polish school on Saturday to see Polish titles alongside the Ealing Gazette in the newsagent. So sort of, I guess what I want to answer this question about the twin things of Brexit and the pandemic is through the eyes of the diaspora community in West London, really. And I suppose with all diasporas, there are sub-communities within communities. So the people I grew up with consider themselves, or their parents did, as the intellectuals. You know, these were doctors. Even my school teachers, we had a Miss Jolowicz, a Miss Pichetta. And I'm very rare in that I represent my home community that I still live amongst and that I grew up in, I went to school. So, you know, my teachers, people like that, often, some of them, sadly, given the age I am, they're no longer around. So it's their children that I now represent. And so there was always a bifurcation between the sort of ex-servicemen's children or the intellectuals or whoever, the people who remember the government in exile, which was in London, and the 04 plumbers and plasterers. There's a little bit of snobbery, and I know this from within my own parents who always thought they came from, well, I think it was East Pakistan, it was India, British India, it was Bangladesh. My grandmother used to say how she'd been in 4 countries and never moved house once. So anyway, they also thought they were better than, I don't know, the Somalians or whoever the more recent people were at the time. They're no longer with us. So, I mean, what has changed since when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s and now? I mean, what I would say is that, I mean, some of these things, vicissitudes happen anyway. 2011, Ealing saw riots. These were odd consumerist riots. And it was commented at the time that a suburban place, a leafy suburban place, saw buildings largely smashed glass, actually, nothing set on fire in Ealing. Croydon, I think, had buildings set on fire. Anyway, there was a Polish delicatessen that had been there since 1953. That chap was interviewed a lot, that he had glass smashed, and he was saying, I'm not part of these 04 more recent people. I've been here since 1953, and I had my glass smashed. That is now a Starbucks. So that is sort of globalization for you. I think he probably made, you know, quite a pretty penny from selling that. What also has happened? I mean, some of my friends are now, they've got other surnames. They're not called Dabski-Nerlich or Dunning-Bukowski. They're called Perkins or whatever, because that is a natural thing with intermarriage and second generations. But again, we've heard this thing about the contraction of brain drain of people going home. Eva mentioned it since Brexit. So I asked for these figures. Apparently, we have a 7% Polish population in Ealing, and it peaked in 2017, as far as I understand. I mean, look, we have a lot of similarities between our two countries. So we have two centre-right governments that feel, well, if you're me, who's only ever seen opposition, Sir Malcolm has seen peaks and troughs throughout his long life. I've only ever been on the opposition benches. So it feels like we've had these right-wing governments in for quite a long time, 2015 in your case. And also, they seem to be defying political gravity, I would say. So, I mean, our own Conservative Party should be a low-tax party. Yesterday, they voted for, I voted against it, a tax rise for everyone in the form of national insurance, every working person, businesses at a time where it's supposed to be growing out of a recession. Your government, I understand from my Polish friends who come back and forth a lot, has become very popular on the back of child benefit. I just can't imagine that happening, but it's the party of the family, the Law and Justice Party, which again, the modern Conservative Party see themselves as party of the family, but I can't imagine them spraying benefits. I think the original family to 500 policy has been accelerated further. So yeah, they seem to be defying political gravity, and I'd say someone like Boris Johnson is a complete political cross-dresser. I mean, he wrote a column for remaining in the EU and against, remember this, and then tossed a coin or took the calculation that the Conservative membership would make him PM if he went for the against, although his heart wasn't really in it. I mean, look, I could go on and on. I mean, we know that us leaving the EU and leaving the European Parliament has made that EPP group a bit less viable because, I mean, it was presented to us that, oh, the Conservatives are joining not the most far-right group, but the sort of penultimate one, the slightly, you know, but with the Law and Justice Party in there, at least Conservative Party gave that some respectability. Now they've gone, that ballast is missing. You know, I mean, we both managed to escape the euro, didn't we? I mean, we're never going in that now, or not in the foreseeable. I still harbour hopes that maybe, not immediately, but 10 years' time, I would like to see in my lifetime that Labour could be a rejoin party, because I think it was a monumental mistake. I mean, I've been told not now, did you learn nothing? If anyone internally pipes up about this, you know, it's seen as, we saw the loss of the red wall seats last time. So I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But, you know, I'd like to see one day that those sands will shift. But you guys escaped as well. You still have the zloty, proudly.
Yeah. Yes, we have.
I mean, climate change we're supposed to be talking about a little bit, aren't we? Climate change, I think, is one of those things that is too big to be another Boris sort of whim or U-turn or, you know, bluster. And as far as so we have a very ambitious target in the UK to be carbon neutral by 2030. I think that will mean a 78% reduction of emissions. I think Poland has also signed up to the Paris Climate Accords, which are legally binding, but they have no target date. And I wonder about our own government, because so many things have been U-turned on. International aid, the pension triple lock the other day, no border down the Irish Sea, oven-baked deal. You know, we could do a long list of these. No tax rises, the list goes on and on. But look, I mean, on the whole, I think what we have seen is that the... and, you know, I get lobbied about unusual things. Rafał Ziemkiewicz, he wanted to come and speak in my seat in Acton. So I had people emailing saying, don't let this hate preacher in. So then I made representations, and in the end, he didn't come. But I also had the odd person. I think they were outweighed by the people that didn't want him coming. He's a Holocaust denier. I have 2 synagogues as well as a Polish church. I have been to Poland, I think, 4 times now. One of them was to Auschwitz. So, I mean, it doesn't completely count because I did not see Poland as Poland. It was a long day where you go around the death camps. But anyway, my point is that, I get lobbied on things other MPs don't. So some people were saying you've, you know, stopped free speech, but most people did not want to see him spreading hatred in the UK. Also, just recently, our council did a policy of, I think it's part of national policy to make driving more onerous for people, because if we're going to cut climate CO2 emissions, so if you sort of make, I think block is the wrong word, but make it, people have to go a long way round. They will be discouraged from driving. Sorry, I'll finish on this one. And I wrote an article in the Sunday Telegraph. So some of us can do political cross-dressing. That's a right-wing newspaper, but they would take my copy on low-traffic neighbourhoods. I said, people feel they're living in ghettos. Someone wrote in and said, my parents lived in a real ghetto. How dare you use that language? So again, I think other MPs would not have been told that necessarily, but it's something I'm very aware of. Anyway, look, the point is, I think the Polish Brits are a very resilient community, despite Brexit, despite the pandemic. They are here to stay. They are a law-abiding, tax-paying, you know, generally respected community. And, you know, as an opposition MP, I get asked, you know, our figures are not great at the moment. What do you think of the polls? And I always say, I don't trust the polls, but when it comes to the settled community in Ealing Central and Acton, I do trust the polls.
Thank you. Charles, please.
What I'd really like to talk about is the future of Europe and how it's changing in ways that are going to make both the British and the Poles very uncomfortable. We're going to be living in a French-dominated Europe without Merkel, but I've been told I have to talk about Brexit. So I'm going to talk about Brexit for a few minutes, and I may have time in the Q&A that follows to come back to the EU as a whole. First point about Brexit, people in Britain have no idea how hard Brexit is. Hard meaning minimising ties between the UK and the EU. To quote what one of Barnier's deputies said to me at one of the CR events about a year ago, she said, if you talk to the guys in Downing Street about the Brexit deal, they were then negotiating the trade and cooperation agreement, if you talk to them, they just don't care about the economics. All they care about is regulatory sovereignty and autonomy. And if you say to them, but this or that model will produce more or less trade, they're not interested in the trade. And that's actually true. The deal we've gone for is a free trade agreement of the Canada style, with nothing for British services companies in that deal, with a lot of delay and hassle at the border to create friction in trade, which is not even being applied yet as far as goods going from the EU to the UK are concerned, and restrictions on free movement of labour, which are causing serious disruptions already to the British economy. So it's a very hard Brexit. But the EU is not entirely guiltless either, because the EU also has not maximised trade in the way it's approached the European negotiations with the Brexit negotiations with the UK. The EU's had 3 principles driving it throughout, as far as I can see. The first and most important is this great integrity of the single market, in particular the protection of the level playing field, meaning that the UK shouldn't be allowed to cut and slash regulation, social, environmental regulation, other sorts of regulation and taxation and so on. I think the EU went over the top because the UK is not going to become Singapore-on-Thames. There's no way the Tory party wants to cut drastically social environmental regulations, but the EU went over the top on that. But I think the EU was sincere in fearing a super-competitive, turbocharged British economy on its off the edge of Europe. The second driver of the EU was pure mercantilism. This is the French, but not only the French. The French admit it, others support it but don't admit it. Pure mercantilism. That they wanted to design the Brexit deal so that financial services firms relocated to the EU, so aerospace companies, car companies, law firms relocated. It was designed to damage the British economy for the benefit of the EU, which is fair enough. I suppose all's fair in love, war and Brexit negotiations. And then the third principle was simply Macron. This is a Macron principle, but I know it's shared in countries like the Netherlands and Sweden. If you have a big powerful Eurosceptic party breathing down your neck. You want to show that Brexit's a crazy idea and that Brexit must be seen to hurt. Pour décourager les autres. And that's certainly, French officials are quite open, and that was one of their objectives in the Brexit talks, was to make sure everybody could see that Brexit was going to be quite painful. But that's where we are. And that's why the EU's not maximised trade at all, as far as I can see. They're not to the same degree as the British. Now, I have to say a word on the Northern Ireland Protocol, because though it's of no interest to most people outside Northern Ireland, as Ava knows, and outside perhaps possibly Paris and Brussels and London, it is actually the most important thing now in the relationship between the UK and the EU. It could blow up very nastily indeed. The basic principles are very clear. As I'm sure you're aware, that there is now a border in the Irish Sea on goods going between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so that the EU can protect the integrity of its single market and its customs union, as Northern Ireland is part of the single market and the customs union, in order to prevent the need to having border controls on goods passing between the north and south of Ireland, because if you had border controls there, the idea is it would upset people who used to support the IRA and endanger the peace process. That's what Boris Johnson and David Frost signed up to in the Withdrawal Agreement. The trouble is, now it's being implemented, it's actually causing massive problems. And what the British government says about it is true. It is causing real social and economic and political disruption, which Ava knows much more about than I do. It's destabilising the political system in Northern Ireland, upsetting the unionist community hugely, who don't like to see a border between themselves and their homeland in England. But the trouble is, although what the British government says is correct, the UK is making an appalling job of persuading the EU to change the protocol, because it's handled it so badly by its very aggressive stance towards the EU, by the tone of it deals with the EU, which is to make everything about sort of Yabu sucks, Brexit's a great idea, the EU's silly. The UK tries to score points all the time. Its ministers and even its officials are always point scoring, which really upsets the EU. And then the UK comes up with silly ideas like the Internal Market Bill of a year ago, which a piece of legislation in Parliament allowing the UK to overrule the withdrawal parts of the Withdrawal Agreement, which is an international treaty. So if you want to persuade the EU to change parts of the protocol, the UK is going about it in a really cack-handed way. And I do fear that the UK could easily apply a so-called Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which means basically tear it up with massively bad consequences. I mean, we can all think of compromises. The compromises have to be the EU agreeing to make some small changes to the protocol, and the UK agreeing to apply the protocol fully, and probably have some agreement with the UK on SPS, that's plant and animal health. But I'm not optimistic at the moment. But now, another point I'd like to make on Brexit is that the funny thing politically is, and I think Rupa might agree with me on this, very few British people are blaming the British government for the very poor deal that the British have got on Brexit. Partly because it's too soon to judge the effects, because as I said, the border controls on goods coming into the UK from the EU have not even been implemented yet. Partly because of COVID has been so damaging to the British economy, it's hard to disentangle what's due to COVID, what's due to Brexit. Partly because public opinion is so incredibly bored by the whole Brexit process. The media talked about nothing else for 4 years, and people just don't want to talk about it. Partly because the media, for various reasons I haven't got time to go into, is quite supine towards the government on Brexit. The media doesn't want to, most media, with some exceptions, don't want to talk too much about Brexit because they don't want to annoy the government, and that applies to the BBC, by the way. Partly because Rupa, the Labour Party, is not saying very much about Brexit, for reasons we can discuss over a coffee afterwards. I mean, Keir Starmer has lost a lot of votes in the north of England and thinks that if he talks too much about Brexit, he won't get those voters back, which may be right, but as a result, nobody's holding the government to account for the poor nature of the Brexit deal. And partly because the government is very good at spinning a narrative that Brexit is a wonderful opportunity with a great boon for the British economy coming, and Boris Johnson is extremely good at spin. So I'm going to stop now, but I'll just say, let me stop on a more optimistic note. I do think in the long run, the Brexit deal will be improved. It has to be improved. It's so bad for so many sections of the British economy. I mean, the London Symphony Orchestra can no longer tour Europe, for example, because of the rules on transport of instruments and cabotage of lorries and so on. I mean, the Brexit deal is so bad in so many ways for so many groups of people. Eventually, either a Tory party led by Rishi Sunak, the more moderate, slightly more moderate Chancellor, will say we need to improve the deal, or a Labour Party government by Keir Starmer will say let's improve the deal. It will be improved. There has to be some cooperation on foreign and defence policy. I mean, one of the most balmy things is there is nothing in the Brexit deal at all on foreign and defence policy. Although Boris Johnson, when he became Prime Minister, signed a declaration saying let's have some cooperation on this, when he came back to Parliament with the bigger majority, he decided to go for the hardline saying let's have no cooperation at all. But Britain needs to have a structural link to the EU on foreign and defence policy so that it can influence what's going on in the EU, so that it can gather intelligence about what's going on in the EU, instead of just pressing our face to the window and looking through the glass, and so that we can build friendships and alliances and develop contacts with partners such as the Poles and others. So I think in the long run, we will have structural links on foreign policy because our values are the same, our interests are very similar, and we need to find ways of working with our partners better than we are at the moment, doing at the moment. But that won't happen so long as Boris Johnson is Prime Minister and David Frost is effectively Europe Minister. I don't see much improvement yet. I have to wait a few years, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. So far we had presented, there was presented a very broad range of different views concerning Polish-British relations. Now let's try to go into a more, let's say, systematic way through, I think, key challenges that define our situation today in this year in the context of this year's forum. So the first thing I wanted to propose is to try to take stock of Brexit negotiations and the results and the first months of Brexit's implementation from different perspectives. Charles has presented an excellent introduction to that part, I think, but I would like to ask Eva to say a few words about her particular perspective as a representative of Polish community in the UK, on one hand, and at the other hand, also an expert in Northern Ireland. And as we all know, Northern Ireland was particularly difficult part of negotiations, and now, unfortunately, remains particularly difficult part of implementation of Brexit.
Yeah, I suppose that countries are like people with their own personalities, all hopes and all their own nightmares. And Northern Ireland is very, very specific. And going back to Belfast Good Friday Agreement, I think a lot of people are forgetting that, it was a result of years of talks about talks, and then framework which addressed 3 sets of different relationships. Relationships of people within Northern Ireland, relationships on the island of Ireland, North and South, and relationship between Britain and Ireland, East-West. I think that whenever we hear a lot of commentary, both from friends in EU, but also our American friends, especially President Joe, I am Irish Biden, people focus a lot about the North-South aspect. Whenever there is a challenge of the East-West, and it's something what Charles touched on, the sea border, it is very easy to radical Brexiters. It is very easy for us to radical the loyalist and unionist communities who are causing problems, but there are really deep, underlying, disturbed historic relationships, which have been, by the way, addressed by the Good Friday Agreement. And if we go back to the history of EU, the setting up of EU was based on addressing those disturbed relationships between France and Germany. So I think it's very, very important to keep reminding ourselves about that we live in a very, very fractured world. And the relationships are really disintegrating. If I compare the relationships on the island of Ireland, the conversations between Dublin and London, and even conversations within Northern Ireland, tensions are really, really high within those communities. And perhaps, everybody needs to stop, pause, repose, and reflect that why Brexit happened. I'm Polish, I'm a Remainer. Obviously, I benefited from EU and from membership of EU. I also understand some of the grievances of people in Britain and also looking at the motivation. It was different from France and Germany. It was very different for Britain. And it was indeed very, very different for Poland whenever we joined EU. We all come from different backgrounds. We all got different objectives. So as Charles said, the situation with Northern Ireland is quite, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson just made a statement on Thursday about pulling out of the Northern Ireland Assembly. I know that there was probably a little bit of, flexing the muscle before Stefkovic's visit to Northern Ireland and his speech at Queen's University in Belfast, when the tone is slightly changing. There is another element, is the Republic of Ireland. Perhaps the previous government and Taoiseach Leo Varadkar was less of a bridge builder than Taoiseach Michael Martin, who perhaps sees himself as a broker, more of a broker between EU and the UK. What we need to do now is to keep rebuilding and building relationships to something what was at the very, very heart of the Good Friday Agreement. It was at the heart of, setup of the European Union. It wasn't all about policy and single market. It was all about building relationships and addressing those very deep historic grievances. And what we're doing right now, we're creating more grievances.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask the two politicians we have here on the panel about respect from their respective perspective, about the ability to building up something like a Brexit consensus for years to come. Because from my perspective as an analyst, I think this is the biggest problem. Within the British domestic politics, this is still a very toxic issue in a sense. But on the other hand, on our Polish and European side, we cannot refrain from seeing that, well, there are, let's say, many different national perspectives in the EU, but those national perspectives, they have to produce, at the end of the day, a single EU policy. So how to approach those challenges for the future when we can see that especially in the last couple of months, that those differences, they can produce very difficult results, which are, at the end of the day, also very difficult to implement. Let's start with Władysław.
Well, first of all, there's no such thing as a common EU foreign policy. It never was. And foreign policy is, by nature, bilateral, or you form certain alliances. There was a famous saying from the 70s where Henry Kissinger said, if I want to call Europe, who do I call? Well, the answer is simple. If you want to call Europe, you call Chancellor of Germany, you call President of France, you call Prime Minister of the UK. These are the people you call. You don't call Brussels. With all due respect, the person who represents the EU in foreign affairs in Brussels means nothing. And it was shown in Moscow about how much respect the powers that the B have towards these type of officials. Of course, there are certain common agreements within the EU, and the lowest common denominator between the 27 now states persuaded, cajoled, bullied, bribed by the strongest members. It's always been like that. But we cannot have much impact on the foreign policy of the EU if we have a bad relationship, as the current government of Poland does, with the Germans and with the French. Thank God, Minister Rau has met for the first time of this government in 8 years. They met Weimar Triangle, that is foreign ministers of Poland, France, and Germany. For me, it was always, and I spoke to him about that when he became a minister, is that the key is to rejuvenate that alliance, because with Poland having if Poland manages to persuade the French and the Germans to support our position, we can do something in Europe. As to the UK, we must have bilateral relations as strong as possible with the UK on the matters of common interest, because it's a folly to. Charles described this Brexit process very well. I mean, Monsieur Barnier did everything possible to be difficult. That was his role. The Brits behaved foolishly, trying to kick him in the ankles every 5 minutes, which didn't achieve anything apart from infuriating the Europeans. And there are certain deep-seated rivalries which are not going to disappear. One of my favorite moments in a famous television series, Yes, Minister, is the poor minister is thinking that maybe Britain should abolish the independent nuclear deterrence, meaning Trident, because it's very expensive and it clearly not much used to be used against the Soviet Union, as it then was. Sir Humphrey, in shock, responds to the minister, but minister, it's not against the Soviets, it's against the French. And that thinking is very prevalent in the UK, and I'm sorry that you didn't win this, the 100 Years' War, and having Bordeaux and in the UK would have been much nicer. So we cannot hide between the common EU foreign policy, be it as it may. And yes, I think EU will have to ease up on the relationship with the UK, because it's all very nice to say, actually we are going to stop the financial services from London being able to operate on the continent, and therefore they will migrate to Paris or Amsterdam or Frankfurt. Well, there are more people working in financial services in the city of London, in a square mile, than there are citizens, the inhabitants of Frankfurt. So let's put things in a certain perspective, and these things are not going to disappear. And it's nothing to do with the economics. It has to do with the law. You cannot do financial services in the non-Anglo-Saxon common law. You can't. It simply doesn't work. All financial centers in the world use the common law. And that's not going to change, much as the French would wish it, or the Germans might wish it. So we have to, on one hand, try to persuade our partners in the EU to see sense. On the other hand, to develop as much as possible the bilateral links with Britain. And this is... there is, of course, one question which cannot be resolved, and that is the Irish question. I had a friend who was an Irish ambassador to Warsaw some years ago, who was the most senior civil servant on the Irish Republican side, or the Republic, on the Republic of Ireland, who was in charge of preparing the Good Friday Agreement. And I asked him, what's going to happen when Brexit was on the cards? What's going to happen? And he said he cannot solve this question. This question is not solvable because of the border. And if you try to solve it the way it's solved, it's a sure way to get United Ireland over time, which is not clearly the thinking necessary in Belfast of large parts of the community.
It depends on who.
It depends. It depends who talks to it. So I think one should be less ideological and more pragmatic, and not put all your faith in the EU institutions, but in your own diplomacy and bilateral relations.
Rupa, try to convince us that there is a hope for stable, long-lasting compromise on Brexit within the British political world.
Yeah, sorry if I'm going to have to disappoint, but I think that it's going to be difficult to reach any Brexit consensus in the UK. This was something that sort of paralysed and polarised for 5 years. It tore apart families, even the Prime Minister's own family. I think his dad is still a big fan, and the sister as well stood against the Conservative Party for a rejoin party in the European Parliament. So, I mean, I think the promises that the Brexiteers made, and again, the footage of Gove and Johnson when they realised they'd won, they weren't meant to win. It was supposed to be a little bit of red meat to the Conservative Party leadership contest, because it's much easier to talk about it than to execute it. So some of those promises, they need us more than we need them. We hold all the cards now. 70 trade deals at 1 minute to midnight on the original leaving date, which I think was the 31st of March 2018 or something. None of those things came to pass. And now we see empty supermarket shelves, as was described. But I think, as Charles said, basically we've seen the strange disappearance of the word Brexit. It has been completely extinguished from political vocabulary. Nobody talks about it. And because we've all lived through coronavirus, everything has been smuggled through that. So yes, those shelves are empty, or are they full of sovereignty? Is that how we interpret the empty shelves with all the... but, you know, people think that's because of COVID or something. All the stuff's been mixed into one, even filling in extra paperwork to come here. And I must say, this was the last place I came to in 2019 before we stopped travelling. Yeah, so there's a whole ton of paperwork that was not needed. I couldn't quite work out, hang on, is that Brexit or is that COVID? You know, the new gates we're going through, not the EU one, but the all passports. So, I mean, I think it is one of those things that nobody wants to open that can of worms again, because people have Brexit fatigue, maybe. Everyone's bored by Brexit after 5 years. So, yes, it was a really shoddy deal. Lots of it is TBC, and those people in the financial services, they're my constituents. I have been a Brexit beneficiary. I first was elected in 2015. I took a Conservative seat by 274 votes. Twice that's been over 13,000 because of Brexit. Anti-Brexit Tories, people saying to me on polling day, I have never voted Labour before, but I work in financial passporting and I want you to save that, and your opponent is not going to do that. So, I mean, we've seen weird things happen in politics. Somewhere like Canterbury, my friend Rosie Duffield represents, that was the student vote, the sort of academic anti-Brexit vote. That was a Conservative seat as well for decades. She took that for the first time ever in 2017. Yet we have seen these so-called red wall places, former mining communities, where I'm afraid it was an easy thing to blame 04 expansions and migrations on their lot. And again, people, you know, don't necessarily have a good level of political education in this country that they know what's going on. You see people interviewed, why did you vote Conservative in the most recent general election? And they say, because we've always had a Labour MP around here and nothing's ever changed. But we've had a Conservative government for 11 years, and they're very clever at conning people that they're new. The Boris Johnson, you know, the Conservatives can change the face at the top and persuade people that it's something new, whereas they've been in power since 2010. So, sorry to sound depressing, I just don't think we're going to reach any consensus on this. I mean, for a long time it was fabled that the younger generation are the people who want to remain. And there was meant to be a tipping point, I think of 2017 or something, that enough young people will overtake that any second referendum would give a yes vote. But, I mean, the results of the 2019 election don't really bear that out. Yeah, I think they just couldn't be bothered to get out of bed in 2016 and vote, because we might have had a different result if they did.
Thanks. Charles, I wanted to ask you one particular question, actually drawing on what you already said. How to build up, how to institutionalize British-European dialogue after Brexit on strategic issues? Obviously, there are dialogue mechanisms, both in the Withdrawal Agreement and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but they are linked to the scope of those agreements, which is not broad enough, I would say. And certainly, any of those agreements, none of them touches upon the really important strategic issues. So, what would be your proposal for building up this kind of dialogue?
Well, let me try and answer that. But let me first just say something in response to Władysław. I agree with just about everything Władysław said, but I think you're a little bit too hard on the EU in foreign policy. The EU is not yet a great and effective actor in foreign policy. It's had its successes over the years. Many of us have forgotten what happened in Macedonia in 2001. Macedonia was on the brink of a civil war. George Robertson, working for NATO, Javier Solana, working for the EU, went to Macedonia, persuaded all the parties to accept a peace settlement, the Ohrid Accords, which worked. Macedonia's been at peace ever since. The Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, which may or may not be revived in the coming weeks, that was basically an EU achievement. I mean, with the Americans, Russians and Chinese jumped on board eventually, but the EU drove that. The sanctions against Russia because of the invasion of Ukraine, those are very strong sanctions. They annoyed the Russians. The EU sanctions are much stronger than the Americans thought they ever would be, but they're quite strong and quite effective, and they have been maintained despite Brexit. So I would say, you know, don't write off the EU as a player in foreign policy. It hasn't had its finest hour recently, because the member states have appointed weak people to the job of High Representative, which is unfortunate. We haven't had the best and biggest names in doing that kind of job. But in the long run, the EU countries do have common interests and common values, and so it makes sense for them to pool their resources in foreign policy. I'm not saying let's have lots of majority voting. I've never been an advocate for QMV on foreign policy. I don't think that would work at all. But I do think in the long run, the EU has potential in foreign policy to help. It needs to, because otherwise it can't stand up to the Russians and the Chinese and others who may threaten its interests, and the Turks. So if the EU isn't good on foreign policy, we need to find ways of making it good, which leads me on to your question. Well, for a start, I mean, the level of knowledge in the British government about the EU is greatly reduced in recent years, and that's nobody's fault, well, except for the Brexiteers. But therefore, I think any event like this forum can help. Any event where British people sit in a room with people from other EU countries helps to reduce the knowledge deficit, which is a big problem in policy making. Think tanks can help. Bilateral forums can help. Schools and universities can help. Britain has left the Erasmus exchange scheme, unfortunately. More specifically, obviously, a close bilateral dialogue can help, and the more we can have UK-Poland summits or UK-France summits. But do you know there's supposed to be a summit between the British and the French every year? There hasn't been one for 3 years. Because nobody in the British government can... The French say we're willing to have one, but we want to have an agenda, and the British government says we can't think of what we want to talk about, so there hasn't been a summit. So the bilateral relationship between Britain and France is really bad, and that's appalling, because we have so many common challenges and so many difficulties we face in the world, and we are the premier 2 military powers in Europe, but nobody's doing enough to try and sort it out. I'm not saying all the fault's on the British side at all. I'm sure there's fault on both sides, but it is a problem. So part of the answer is bilateral, much better bilateral relations. The trouble is the British have used bilateral relations in the last few years just to try and undermine EU unity. The British, throughout the Brexit negotiations, tried to play the Polish card. They sent people to Poland and say, help us undermine European unity. Well, we sent people to Germany saying, let's have more BMW imports and help us. And the EU wasn't playing that game. The EU knew, including the Polish government, knew that actually they had to stay together with their European partners in Brexit to be stronger. So I think if the bilateral relationship is not be used as an excuse to create divisions within the EU. So you have the British government needs to have a more positive attitude to the EU as a whole and not try and score points all the time. But to finish on, you do need structural links. So you need some sort of... I think the British should attend the Political and Security Committee on a regular basis. They should attend meetings of the foreign ministers on a regular basis. There should be summits on a regular basis between the EU and the European leaders. The more contact, the better. The knowledge base will never be as good as it was when we were members, but if we have enough meetings, enough structures in place, we can reduce the deficit to some degree.
Thank you very much. To make sure that we will have enough time for questions from the audience, let me just ask the last question to the panelists concerning COVID. It will be quite general. In your assessment, how do you think, what elements of the COVID pandemic reality will stay with us for longer, and how they will affect relationship between Poland and Britain and the European Union? Travel restrictions, I don't know, trade restrictions, permanently decreased level of personal interchanges. What's your opinion about that? Let's start with Rupa.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine working from home will stick for a large number of white-collar workplaces. I don't know if that's the sense here as well, but in the UK, certainly my staff, I'm an employer myself, so I have 4 people that work for me. Previously, I used to think I had to be there breathing down their neck for them to do stuff. I've realised in the last 18 months, things happen anyway, even if you're not there. Today, and yesterday, I think, no, yesterday we were all in the office, weren't we? Sorry, it's been a long day today already. But yes, they feel sometimes they're more productive working from home, fine, if they want to do that. I mean, it does seem ironic that something to do with distancing and isolation did bring communities much closer together in the UK. So I think every street now has a WhatsApp group. That's probably going to stay, people looking out for neighbours and vulnerable people. Yeah, it's difficult to totally know.
Will this kind of breakthrough, which is first localized, help to foster relationships over the borders, for example? How do you think? Because, you know, once you have big part of population moving to WhatsApp groups, they can work using this tool with friends from other countries.
Certainly, so I represent a seat in suburban London. From what estate agents tell me locally, people want more physical space because they see themselves working from home forever. So flats are less popular unless they have outside garden as well. And I send an email newsletter to about 10,000 people every so often. And the recent ones I've sent, people reply back saying, we actually moved to the country. We loved having you as our MP, but take us off the list because we've gone. So I think people are envisaging, you know, I had never said, you forgot to unmute yourself until April 2021. I'd never done a Skype interview or anything. I always did it in the studio because then they could do your makeup as well. I never did it down the line, and now it's a daily occurrence. I think, again, the aviation sector has, I think at one point was 90% reduction in air travel. But if we've seen it can work and we're meant to be reducing emissions, why not?
Yeah.
I mean, an event like this is ideal because it's both.
Thank you. Eva.
Well, I think that what COVID showed us is the weakness of supply chains, and this is something what is going to stay with us for a while. And, you know, with obviously added complications around Brexit. Very simple example, for instance, with regards to the protocol in Poland, in Northern Ireland and in the UK, there are many Polish shops catering for the Polish diaspora. And what people in Northern Ireland had to do is to divert the deliveries via Dublin. So it's actually when the protocol worked to their benefit because they were able to move the stock via Dublin up the north. But in order to address those massive issues around supply chains, and as I said before, they are not only, you know, things to be addressed within Northern Ireland, UK, Europe, or even in the wider global context, is development of resiliency, you know, and to develop resilient communities, to develop resilient systems, we need relationships. Relationships of trust, relationships where we can hold opposing views, where we can react quickly to all those challenges lying ahead of us. I remember many years ago, I went for a drive in beautiful Mourne Mountains in Northern Ireland, and I came across a small Benedictine abbey. I met the monks, we had conversation, and, you know, they smiled, you know, they learned about my work. And I remember that the abbot came back to me with a book by the Anglican chaplain Esther de Waal called Living with Contradictions. And I think that what we have to learn is to learn living with contradictions and being able to hold those opposing views. Because COVID, Brexit, all those challenges, and as Sir Malcolm mentioned earlier, climate change, all those challenges are to stay with us.
Thank you. Charles, please.
Well, I suppose, as I already said, it's harder to tell what damage to the British economy is caused by Brexit and what is caused by COVID. So it's been a kind of cover-up, in a way, for some of the problems of Brexit, COVID. I think as Eva said, you know, the supply chains are more important now. As I said right at the start of my remarks, we're living in a more French EU. In one respect, it's more French because everybody's become a bit more protectionist, a bit more keen to have strategic autonomy, including economic strategic autonomy, meaning you look after your own supply chains, your own provisions of key sources of equipment and microchips or whatever. So it makes everybody a bit less open, a bit less libre-échangiste, as the French would say. I think that's probably one lasting effect. We live in a more French EU, and the whole world is a little bit more protectionist. You have the sort of decoupling of the US and Chinese IT industries. Final point. I mean, I think the vaccine, the wars about vaccines have really created a big disruptions between Britain and its neighbours and haven't helped at all. Certainly, I don't often agree with Boris Johnson, but he was quite right. He got really annoyed with the French in the spring when they started, the French Europe minister and even Macron himself started bad-mouthing the British AstraZeneca vaccine, saying things about it that were scientifically untrue, saying old people shouldn't have it because it would hurt them. And I know that created huge ill feeling towards the French in Downing Street, not without reason. So I think the sort of wars about vaccines and who's got the better vaccine and who's exporting more vaccines, who's importing more vaccines, that hasn't helped at all relations between Britain and its partners.
Thank you. Władysław.
I think pandemic is going to stay with us. It's not going to go away, and I think the economic world is not going to be the same. There are certain industries which obviously suffered horribly and are kind of semi-disappeared, and others, for instance, people who do deliveries boomed, and people had to readjust. One of the outcomes of it is, of course, a crisis of globalization, which Charles is mentioning, is people are much more selfish, people are much more self-protecting. It's more war-type economy that you have to produce, you have to have stuff for your own benefit. And but this, in the background of that, is a huge conflict which is going to emerge between China and the rest of the world, and China and Europe, because of course the virus is Chinese virus, as President Trump used to say, and it's something in it. China has developed pharmaceutical factories, for instance, and other things which we farmed out to other shores, and now EU starts thinking correctly that we have to have a basis. So like in the war, we have to have a basis, so we have to be able to produce the key elements, the key goods, because we cannot rely on our global partners, especially since the economic and political war with China is growing. Here, as a small aside comment, it is not the EU who was strong in the foreign relations. It's the deal with China was signed because of Mrs. Merkel in December last year, and the sanctions against Russia were passed thanks to Mrs. Merkel, because without her intervention and strong stance, the EU as such wouldn't quite.
Yes, but the deal with China it will not ever happen. But the comprehensive agreement on investment, because the European Parliament has blocked it because of Chinese sanctions against MEPs. So although Mrs. Merkel wants the deal, it will not happen. The European Parliament is going to stop it.
But that's true. She's not no chancellor is, it's not a dictatorship. So we have some ways to moderate it. But it's going to be a new world. It's going to be a new world, and it's not necessarily better, and it's going to be very challenging, and we have to learn to live with this. And of course, some things in terms of working conditions, of course, we will go to remote for some part of it. In Polish Parliament, we've been voting remotely for a year or so. And I remember when the restrictions eased, and for the first time we had a limited, not a full house, but a limited number of MPs were allowed to sit in the house. How happy we were to see people from other parties, including the government, which we don't agree with, because we actually like to see each other, and it's normal. It's normal, but it's obvious that some of that would remain, and travel restrictions will be here. What is striking is that the United Kingdom has the highest rate of people vaccinated in the entire Europe. In the EU, Portuguese are just under the British level. 82% have 2 jabs in the UK. Phenomenal achievement. And I know that the Labour Party is doing a grilling of how the government behaved with the vaccinations. But I'd say, apart from some mistakes which were made, the Brits can be given as an example of how to do it. With AstraZeneca, with Oxford, and with government, and it was very well done. But even in Britain, you've got 27,000 new cases in a day, like yesterday, 27, and 169 or whatever dead. I mean, in other words, even if you vaccinate 82% of the population, you still have the virus.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to come back because you've got the mutations, and we have to have 3rd dose, and so on and so forth. We're going to live with this. It's like we used to live. I mean, I could live with the flu. Mm-hmm. So I think that is going to, but I think there'll be less globalization. I think that's the main outcome economically.
Thank you. Now I would like to open the floor to questions. I propose we proceed with one question from the audience in our conference room, and one question from the audience in front of their monitors and television sets. So do we have any questions here in this room to one or all of our panelists, please? Could I ask each person asking the question to introduce themselves, give their affiliation? Let me just say that the questions being asked online, they all come with affiliations.
Okay. Robert Przemysław, I'm a senior fellow with the Połacki Foundation. Short and very easy question. Sorry, to the panelists. I'll go there. In 5 years' time, to make it even easier, if there is an opinion poll in UK, how many people will regret the Brexit decision? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, I guess that this is a question to Rupa and Charles as our British speakers. Well, to all of them, all of you, okay.
I'm not Mystic Meg, who is the famous fortune teller. I mean, I think already polls are showing people there is, you know, buyer's remorse at Brexit. But I think after all that, it's just not going to be reopened anytime quick. I mean, even the speed at which that deal was rammed through, there was one day that Parliament had an emergency sitting between Christmas and New Year, and what had taken 5 years was shoved into half a day on the 28th of December or something. I was in the virtual chamber to speak. I was the next one it cut off because they'd reached their allocation of time. So, I mean, it was just a very tawdry, face-saving thing at the last moment. Many bits of it, professional qualifications, all sorts of things are TBC. They've not even, they're, you know, in a memorandum that will be discussed further down the line. Yeah, I mean, I was regretting it from the day it happened. And, yeah.
Yes, I mean, there's been a small majority in favour of the EU ever since the referendum, but Rupa's right. There isn't going to be another referendum in any time soon, not in my professional career anyway. And even if there was, I don't think we could just get back into the EU very easily. The EU is quite clear about this, and the EU leaders would be clear about this. Unless there's a national consensus in Britain in favour of joining, they wouldn't want us, because if we rejoined and then the Tory party in opposition was committed to taking us out 5 years later, and then we, you know, the EU would say, it's ridiculous, every few years you're in and out, in and out, in and out. The EU would say, no, no, no. So if the Tory party, and Malcolm Rifkin have a better view on this than I would, is it suddenly becomes pro-European and says we'd like to support EU membership, then it becomes viable. But I don't see that happening in the near future, I'm afraid. So I think Brexit isn't going to be reversed for 20 years, ever.
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely, please.
Well, I don't want to be overly controversial, but what the state of European Union will be in 5 years. There is another question that, you know, who knows, perhaps in 5 or 10 years, people will look back and say, well, perhaps Brits had something in there. So I think that, you know, like Europe needs to take stock of what happened and what is happening and, you know, what future holds.
Yeah.
If I may, I just quote, I mentioned Lord King, the head of Bank of England, former head of Bank of England, and he said, for the first 5 years after Brexit, it would be complete chaos. After 5 years, it wouldn't have mattered either way. It would be the same.
Yeah. So we have one question from the audience, online audience. Which changes or reforms in the EU would be particularly beneficial for the European Union-United Kingdom relationship? I guess this is a question especially to Charles, but I believe our political friends would probably also have opinion about that.
Well, I think I've always been agree with Emmanuel Macron on one thing, that you need to have more so-called variable geometry, more, in the jargon, differentiated integration. Why should Poland be forced to join the Eurozone if it doesn't want to join the Eurozone? Why should Ireland be forced to join Schengen if it doesn't want to? Why should Denmark be forced to take part in European defence cooperation if it doesn't want to? So I think the more you have variable geometry, the more you have different kinds of membership with different countries doing different things, the easier it is for the UK to jump onto a few of the outer rims of the EU without being a full member and become members, maybe the members of the Defence Cooperation, which would make eminent sense from the British point of view and the European Union point of view. I think Macron is sympathetic to this thinking. He, in his big speech he made on the EU just after he became president, he talked about this. It's gone off the agenda a bit recently, but I think a more variegated EU is one that's better for the UK. If the EU is a single integrated bloc that does everything together, it's everybody very integrated, it's harder for the UK to relate to it.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think Remain and Reform was not pushed enough in the referendum campaign. I mean, both sides had very crude arguments. And, you know, maybe if the Remainers hadn't... Because I think it was trying to scare people that there'd be an emergency budget on day one, that the sky would fall in, and the sky has not fallen in. So I think Remain and Reform was not ever pushed. And the idea that it was a pecuniary thing when it was more of a gut feeling for a lot of people. But I mean, if you turn the question around which particular reforms should be enacted, there's also which particular EU directives made your life unbearable. And if you meet a leaver, they're never able to answer that one either.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you if our audience in the room has any questions. Please.
I have a question concerning relationships between United Kingdom, Poland, European Union and China. As Mr. Bartoszewski said, conflict between US and China are growing, and we have to find common platform to counter the Chinese approach to the world. The way the Chinese government treated Australia in recent months show how the Chinese world could look like. So do you think there is a chance to build a broad coalition of West against China, or particular interests between, I don't know, United Kingdom, European Union, Poland and the United States, Canada, maybe India, prove that this West platform cannot be built?
It's very difficult to have a coalition against China in Europe for the very simple reason that if you look at the balance of trade and investments of Germany into China, and you look why the automotive industry, which Volkswagen says 40% of its cars in China, the trade level of Germany and China is incredible in investments. And investment, what does it mean investment? Investment means that if they say, okay, we break off the relations, you lose all the money. It's been happening in not only in the Soviet Union in the old days, but also in Russia. Shell lost $20 billion in Russia in the 90s, and so what? You know, BP lost $7 billion, and you know these things happen. And in China, you have to multiply by 100, and then you see how much the trouble with investing in a country which is not democratic is that if they want to squeeze you out, there's nothing much you can do, and the loss is horrendous. Think Bolshevik Russia when after the revolution, investors lost everything. So there is no way it's going to happen like that. Of course, the United States have various weapons at its disposal, because nobody is going to... Britain was an example of trying to get Huawei to do 5G, and the American says, you want to be part of the intelligence exchange with us or not? If you do, take the Chinese, you'll stop getting the intelligence. And the Brits had to go back. Of course, the Americans are now start thinking that India used to be a country closely linked with the Soviet Union, but Americans start looking at it now. India is not pro-Chinese and is the largest democracy in the world. Maybe there's something in it. But I do not quite see the Europeans jumping on that bandwagon, because apart from selective security issues, because because of economic interests. And it's very, it's for countries like Poland, it's highly uncomfortable because we are a small little place being squeezed between two giants. But I do not quite see 5G coming from Huawei to Poland either, for having said all that. But it's, well, and of course, what China did to Hong Kong is not inspiring confidence, and the rumblings about Taiwan is the same. So on the security issues, we share some common concerns.
Thank you. I'm afraid, due to time constraints, we have to finish. I wanted to thank our panelists for their thoughts and for sharing those thoughts, obviously, with us. Let me summarize the panel probably in one sentence, that it appears in the light of our discussion that the title, Polish-British Relationship in Post-Brexit and Post-Pandemic World, was proven to be over-optimistic. We are not in post-Brexit world, we are post-Brexit negotiations world, but the real results of Brexit will be revealing themselves over many years. And unfortunately, probably the same could be said about post-pandemic world. So thank you very much for your contributions, ladies and gentlemen. Let us thank our panelists, ladies and gentlemen.